If you do have a copy of God's Word with you, I invite you to take it out and you can make your way to the Gospel of Mark chapter 12. Mark chapter 12. You know, if you want to get somebody in trouble with people, then all you need to do is, in a public setting, ask them to share their thoughts on matters related to either politics or religion, right? And that's what happens to Jesus in this passage. And it's actually a question related to both politics and religion. And when those two topics come together, it becomes particularly combustible. But some men ask Jesus questions related to Caesar because they want to get him in trouble. They want to trap him. What I want us to see this morning in this text is that while certainly this is a passage that, as we'll see, gives us some really good and important lessons about how Christians ought to think about and relate to governing authorities, that this is a text, however, where the focus of the text is not Caesar and it's not taxes. The focus of the text is Jesus. And that's so important, and God is so kind in his providence to bring us to this text today. I didn't plan it this way, but this is just the goodness of God, because tomorrow, January 20th, Inauguration Day, and our nation will install her 47th president, and there will be all of this conversation nationally about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing and what the implications will be for our country and for the world. And all of the focus and attention of our nation will be upon that, on that act of inauguration. But our text this morning reminds us that ultimately the focus of our hearts and the focus of our very lives should never ultimately be on Caesars or on presidents or on administrations that come and go, but instead upon Christ, who is supreme over every aspect of life and the world. And so it's a very timely word. It's a very timely word, I believe, that God has for us this morning. If we just kind of reset the context, if we could, for the Gospel of Mark. Last Sunday we saw Jesus in the temple was approached by some men who Mark described as the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. And these were the three major groups that made up a 71-member governing body known as the Sanhedrin, that was the kind of the ruling body over Israel's religion. And these guys were the real power brokers in Israel. And they came to Jesus questioning his authority. You remember that? By what authority do you do these things? And what we're going to see as we move through the rest of chapter 12 in Mark's gospel is that this group, the Sanhedrin, is going to send Jesus a series of representatives, each of which is going to bring a question to Jesus. So our text this morning, the representatives sent by the Pharisees are some of the Pharisees and Herodians. And they come with a question about taxes. And the next up will be the Sadducees, and they're going to ask Jesus a question related to the resurrection. And then after that, one of the scribes is going to come, and he's going to ask Jesus a question about the law. And we're going to see that Jesus is going to take on each one of these questions. And these were questions, guys, that divided the people. These were questions that confused the people in Jesus' day. And frankly, they're questions that deal with topics that divide and confuse people still today. But they don't confuse Jesus at all. Jesus is going to answer each one of these questions with incredible insight and incredible discernment, even to the point where Mark tells us in verse 34 of chapter 12 that after he's done, no one dared ask him another question, because Jesus can't be trapped. He can't be trapped. His wisdom is unmatched. With eyes like fire and hair like wool, we see Jesus' supreme discernment and wisdom addressing some of the greatest questions of his day. What Mark's doing here is he's actually presenting Jesus as the greater Solomon. If you remember, Solomon was a king of Israel over kind of a golden era of Israel, who built the temple of God and whose wisdom was unmatched. Remember, people would come from all over the world to see Solomon's wisdom, but a greater Solomon has come. A king over a greater golden era for the people of God, a king who is going to build a new temple, a spiritual temple, and whose wisdom is not just unmatched, but who is in himself the very wisdom of God. The wonderful counselor, the one who has answers for all of life's questions in the world. We struggle. We struggle to see life clearly. We struggle to see the world around us clearly, but Jesus doesn't struggle at all. He can see it all clearly. And so I want us to look at the answer he gives to the first question that he's asked this morning. And just like the people that Mark tells us at the end of verse 17, I want us to be amazed by him. Let's be amazed by him. So first up to the plate are the Pharisees and the Herodians. Now, we saw this unlikely alliance form back in Mark chapter 3, verse 6. And it's surprising that these two groups, Pharisees and Herodians, are working together, because in reality they despised each other. These were two groups that did not get along. Maybe you'll remember me talking about this when we were in chapter 3 several months ago. The Pharisees were the conservatives of the day, moral, religious conservatives, and they were very concerned about how Rome's authority might compromise the purity of Israel. So they would have paid taxes, but they would have done so very reluctantly because they despised Rome's rule over Israel. So the Herodians, on the other hand, were the progressives. They were the kind of the moral, even religious progressives of this era. They had a very close relationship with King Herod and the Roman government, and they would have been very much in favor of Roman taxation. Okay, so this is akin to far-right conservatives coming together across the aisle to form an alliance with far-left progressives, and they're coming together in this unlikely alliance because they have a common enemy named Jesus. And he's a common enemy of theirs because he is threatening both of their status and power and influence in the people. And here's the thing about people from every part of the political spectrum. They all like status and power. And when it's threatened, they get upset. And so you see this uncommon alliance, and they come together, and Mark tells us they come together to try to trap him. Trap him in his words is what it says. And I want you to look at how they begin. In verse 14, they come to him and they say, "Teacher, we know you are truthful, and we know that you don't care what anyone thinks, nor do you show partiality, but you teach the way of God truthfully." Do you see what they're doing? Right? They're buttering him up. They're laying on the flattery pretty thick here. Because when you set a trap for an animal, you're going hunting and you want to trap an animal, you don't want the trap to be obvious, right? You want to kind of camouflage the trap. You want to kind of hide the trap. You want to make the animal to feel comfortable. You want to try to lure the animal in, guards down, and so you can trap the animal. And that's what they're doing to Jesus here. They're trying to, with their flattery, they're trying to make him feel comfortable. They're hoping he won't see their intent. They're trying to lure him in with all of their flattery. Now the irony is that even though their motives are evil, their words are actually true. And that's the irony, is he doesn't show partiality. He doesn't care what anybody thinks of them. And so this flattery that you're laying on him actually isn't going to do any good, because he doesn't care. He doesn't. Jesus' opinions does not blow in the wind of public approval rating. Okay, he speaks truth, and he operates by what is true and right in the will of his Father, no matter what people say or think. And so he's not going to be manipulated by people, and that's exactly what they're trying to do. They're trying to manipulate him. And so they've laid on this flattery, and then they set the trap. They ask the question. Look at the question in verse 14. Here's the question. He says, Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay or shouldn't we? Now, the tax that they're asking about specifically was the imperial poll tax, or a head tax, that was actually implemented by Rome over the Israelites in 6 A.D. It wasn't a property tax. It wasn't an income tax. It wasn't a tariff on merchandise or commerce. It was a tax just for being a citizen of Israel under Roman rule. If you were a living person, you paid this tax because you live under our rule. And so as you can imagine, when Rome implemented this, it didn't go over very well. One thing that's true of people from every era of human history is they don't like to pay taxes. And they actually they despised this tax in particular. There was a man named Judas the Galilean who would lead a movement revolting against Rome that would later come to be known as the Zealots, and they refused to pay this tax, this poll tax. This is unfair. This is unjust. We won't pay it. So this was a hot button issue. This was a very relevant topic that they're asking Jesus about, and that's why they ask, because they think they're going to trap him. Because if he says, don't pay your taxes, you kidding me? It's unfair taxation. To pay this tax to Caesar would make you complicit in the paganism and immorality of the Roman Empire. You're a part of a different kingdom now. You need to revolt. You need to stand against this tax. Don't pay your tax. If he says that, he's going to be in trouble with Rome. And Rome's going to do the dirty work that they don't want to do, because Rome was very sensitive to influential leaders who had revolutionary tendencies. If you're an influential leader at this time and you start teaching in such a way that could be interpreted as you shouldn't pay taxes to Caesar, then Caesar's going to come after you. But then on the other hand, if Jesus says, you know what, pay the tax. What they're hoping is that the people will turn against him. So maybe Caesar will be okay with him, but he will lose favor with the people. So the trap is set. Should Israelites pay this unfair poll tax to the corrupt, pagan Roman Empire or not? That's the question. Well, verse 15 tells us that Jesus sees right through their flattery, and he sees their hypocrisy. And so how does he answer the question? Well, he starts by asking for a denarius. Now, a denarius was a little silver coin that valued at about a one day wage for the average person living in in Palestine. And you would actually, this was the currency of Rome, so you would actually use a denarius to pay the poll tax. And on the denarius was a lot like the coinage today in America. There's a picture of somebody, and on the denarius there was an image of Caesar, the emperor of Rome. He says, "Bring me a denarius," and they bring him a denarius, and he asks the question. And in verse 16 he says, "Whose image and inscription is this?" And of course they say, "Well, that's Caesar's image there." And so then he says this line, the line that we all know and remember, verse 17. Jesus told them, "Give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And they were utterly amazed at him. Now that word image that is used in verse 16 would have been the same word that was used in the creation account in Genesis, when we're told that God created people, he created humanity in his own image. And so what Jesus is saying here is that, yes, you should give to Caesar that which is marked by his image, namely the denarius for this poll tax, and you should give to God that which is marked by his image. And what is marked by the image of God but your very life? Your very life is created in God's image. That is what is owed to God. In other words, Jesus is saying that governing authorities are indeed legitimate, but they are not ultimate. They are legitimate, but not ultimate. Earthly governments are legitimate institutions established by God, and thus possess legitimate authority on earth that we are to acknowledge and honor, and yet their authority, even though legitimate, is limited in its scope and reach. That God's authority is supreme over the world and over our lives that bear his image. Okay. God's authority is supreme because his image is reflected in all of creation. Okay. And so that is the response that Jesus gives to the question. What I want to do is I want to give you two exhortations from this teaching I believe God has for us this morning. Kind of set the scene, help you understand what's being said, what's going on here. I want to exhort you in two ways from this text. Okay. The first exhortation is this. Number one, we should recognize both the legitimacy and the limits of governing authorities. We should recognize both the legitimacy and the limits of governing authorities. So let's think about both of those things, legitimacy and limits. When Jesus says to give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, in that statement he is affirming the legitimacy of earthly government and earthly governing authorities. Jesus does not say you should revolt. You don't pay your taxes. You are now a part of a different kingdom. You have the freedom to rebel and to ignore Caesar or the authority of the Roman government. He doesn't say that. To the contrary, Jesus actually says, no, you should give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Pay your taxes. That his authority, the authority of earthly government, is legitimate. It is a legitimate authority. And of course, that is a teaching that would be expanded upon later and affirmed by later in the New Testament in passages like Romans 13, right? That affirms that God has established earthly governing institutions and authorities and leaders with the intent of promoting righteousness, with the intent of protecting the weak, the vulnerable, with the intent of trying to restrain, though imperfectly, the depravity of humanity, and that Christians should honor these authorities. There is an honor that is due there. That Christians have a responsibility to steward our earthly citizenship carefully and thoughtfully and faithfully. And so, yes, we pay our taxes. This is a part of our stewardship as citizens of a legitimate earthly kingdom. We steward that by serving sometimes. Some Christians may serve in public offices, may serve in public institutions, may serve in the military and other representatives of the state and earthly nations. This is a part of our stewardship. We live as salt and light, and as salt and light, we promote the righteousness of God within society and within the earthly nation that God has placed us. And so in that statement, Jesus is affirming and recognizing that earthly governments, this is legitimate. There's a legitimate authority that they have. But when Jesus then also says, and give to God the things that are God's, and that statement, he is affirming the limits of governing authorities. You see, God indeed has given government and earthly governing authorities a particular role on earth and a particular measure of authority on earth. In other words, there is a jurisdiction, if you will, a realm of authority that God has delegated and given to earthly governing authorities. But what is the jurisdiction of God? What is the realm of authority for God? What are the things that belong to God? Well, of course, everything falls under his authority, right? Like his authority is supreme. The reach of God's ownership, the reach of God's authority has no limits. God is ultimate. You know, Caesar's image may be on the denarius, but God's image is actually on Caesar. It all belongs to him. And so what Jesus is affirming is both. We should recognize both the legitimacy, but then also the limits of governing authorities. And so you think about those limits, it means, I think, a couple of things. It means, for one, that our allegiances to earthly nations and earthly authorities are limited. God calls us to give a measure of allegiance to earthly authorities, the nation wherein we live, but that allegiance is not absolute. It is not supreme. It's limited. Our allegiance to God is absolute. Our allegiance to God is supreme because our lives bear his image, not Caesar's. So that means that if a governing authority requires the Christian to act in a manner that is biblically sinful, we obey God rather than man, because God's image is on our lives. He is our creator. We belong to God, not to Caesar. And so there's a limiting of our allegiances. It also means that the hope that we put in earthly government's ability to solve the world's ills and problems, that hope is also limited. So not just our allegiances, but also our hope in earthly governing authorities. Yes, by God's common grace, God has used earthly nations and earthly governments and governing authorities to do much good in the world, to help restrain the depravity of humanity, to bring, though imperfect, at least a semblance, a measure of justice and righteousness in the world. But we acknowledge they do this imperfectly. Earthly governments do this imperfectly, that there's no government. There is no leader of the state who can solve the world's problems, because the world does not belong to Caesar. Caesar didn't create the world, and Caesar cannot save the world. And it's such a timely word, because tomorrow at 11 o'clock a.m., there are going to be many in our nation who are rejoicing. There are going to be many in our nation who are mourning. And, wherever you find yourself on that spectrum of rejoicing and mourning, this is a reminder that we must be careful not to put our ultimate hope in any man or institution. Don't give your hope to Caesar. Your hope belongs to God. And don't give unto Caesar the things that are God's. Okay, so we should recognize both the legitimacy as well as the limits of governing authorities. That's the first exhortation from the text. Here's the second exhortation I want to give you from the text. Number 2, we should not give temporary concerns ultimate weight. We should not give temporary concerns ultimate weight. They ask Jesus this question about the poll tax, because it was considered like one of the major questions of the day there in Israel. This was a question that was really important to the people. There was a question that was really important to these leaders. This was a question wherein there were positions and there were camps and there was division, and on all sides there were really passionate opinions on what you think about this poll tax and what we should do as the people of God about this poll tax. This was very important to them. It was a heavy issue for them. Okay. Which is why I think it's noteworthy how little Jesus actually talks to them about taxes. One sentence. They were probably expecting a treatise, but Jesus gave them a sentence. Give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. That's it. It's almost as if tax reform isn't Jesus' primary concern. Okay. Now, I want you to look at verse 15. So they come to Jesus, and they want to talk taxes. Jesus, what's your position on this unjust poll tax that Rome implemented? Do we pay it? What's your position? But what's Jesus' focus? Where is Jesus' mind according to verse 15? His focus is on their hypocrisy. That's what he sees. Jesus is concerned with their hearts. Okay? They wanted to talk about tax reform. He wants to talk about heart reform. Okay? They want to have a conversation on matters of democracy. He wants to have a conversation on their hypocrisy. This is why Jesus tells them to give to God the things that are God's. What belongs to God? your heart, your very heart, your very life belongs to God. And so Jesus says, pay your taxes, okay? But the greater issue here is your heart. Give your heart. Whatever you think about taxes, give your heart to God. It's instructive for us, church. It means we must be careful not to give to Caesar or to any other person or institution or relationship that which belongs to God, namely our hearts. Our hearts belong to God. When the affections and passions of our hearts are focused on Christ and his kingdom, then matters of temporary concerns like taxes, it's not that they don't matter. They do, but we simply recognize they're not ultimate. They're not primary. The devotion of our hearts to God is ultimate. We should not give temporary concerns ultimate weight. I want you to consider, just think of Jesus' disciples, who, very likely were with him as all of this was going down. So within this group of disciples, right, you have, you actually had zealots, like Simon, right, who refused to pay this tax. And in fact, he wanted to revolt against Rome altogether. He was fed up with Roman taxation, and I'm going to draw the sword, and I'm going right after him. And around that same campfire was literally a tax collector named Matthew, whose job it was to do the very thing that this guy hated. How did they get along? How did this work? How did Jesus hold this group together? It was possible. We can't even get through a Thanksgiving meal, one Thanksgiving meal, without ready to go out and throw blows with family members, right? Because they don't agree with us on our political convictions. They lived life together. They traveled together. They were with each other. It was possible because these temporary concerns like Caesar, like Rome, and like taxes stopped having ultimate weight upon their hearts and in their lives. There are many temporary concerns, guys, that are valid and they are important and they are good for us to think about and even discuss carefully, thoughtfully. But when we give temporary concerns a seat of ultimate weight in our hearts, meaning that they are the heaviest factor on our affections, our relationships, and our passions, in that moment we are giving to something else that which belongs to God. Okay. Now this it could be political concerns, or it could be a whole host of other earthly temporary concerns. It could be financial concerns. It could be vocational concerns. It could be relationship concerns. All of these concerns are valid. They're important, but they're not ultimate, right? They're not ultimate. Don't give them something that belongs to God. If God changes your financial situation, if he changes your vocational situation, if he changes your political situation, if he changes your living situation, if he changes your ministry situation, if he changes any of it, it doesn't change your identity in Christ as a son or daughter of God. That you are a citizen of an eternal kingdom of God that is so much bigger and more ultimate than all of these other things. Don't give your ultimate affections or your ultimate sense of identity to that which is temporary, because those things belong to God. Your sense of identity belongs to God. Your affections belong to God. Your passions and heart belongs to God. God wants your heart. He wants your heart. He cares about your politics. He cares far more about the devotion of your heart. He saw the hypocrisy of their hearts. That was his concern. Guys, listen, the weight that we give to matters of this life, not just what you think about the matters of this life, but the weight that you give them in your heart is of great significance in your discipleship and in a Christian life. How you weigh matters in your heart. We should not give temporary concerns ultimate weight. I'm sure, like you, a few days ago, I was watching the funeral service for the now late President Jimmy Carter. There at the National Cathedral in Washington, and like you know, I find it fascinating whenever, because it's so rare, whenever all of the living presidents are together in one spot, current and past. And I'm watching these clips and I'm the photos, and of course, all of America becomes body language experts when this happens, right? And we're all lip readers, and what were they saying, and what were they talking about, and who stood and who didn't stand, and who extended a hand, and who didn't. How did she look? Did she look sideways? I think she looked kind of sideways. We're like obsessed with this because, and I suppose it makes sense. I mean, these are some of the most powerful, significant, influential people on planet Earth, and they're all sitting right there together. And it struck me as I was watching it. It struck me that the reason they were all together is because one of them had died. It was a funeral service. They're literally there together because of the reality of mortality. And yet, as powerful and influential as they are, it's only a matter of time before they're the ones in the box. I don't mean to be crass, but that's the reality of it. And when that happens and they're put in the ground, guess what? Life will go on, and history will go on. Humanity will go on. Because they're limited, and they're not ultimate. They're not supreme. See, there's only one leader. There's only one kingdom whose power and influence and reign will never end. He's ultimate, and his kingdom is supreme. And so let the name of that leader, King Jesus, let that name weigh heaviest on your heart. Okay? Let that name weigh heaviest on your sense of identity, on your affections, and on your allegiances. Earthly governing authorities are legitimate, but they're not ultimate. We should recognize both the legitimacy and the limits of governing authorities, and we should not give temporary concerns ultimate weight. I want to ask you this morning, is Jesus your ultimate concern? Such that his agenda, his name, what he has done for you, who he is, weighs more heavily on your heart than anything else going on in your life or in the world around you? Are temporary earthly concerns rightly weighted in your heart? Are they rightly weighted in your heart? Guys, Jesus cares about Caesars. He cares about tax policies, and he cares about all the other, he really does. He cares about all the other temporary concerns that affect my life and yours. But he cares more about the devotion of your heart that bears his image. Give him your heart.